For most people, Sun Tzu is just a name you see on motivational posters, or hear quoted by business gurus who probably never actually read his book. People treat him like some ancient wizard of winning, a guy who figured out how to crush your enemies and come out on top. But here's the thing, that's completely backwards. Because when you actually read what Sun Tzu wrote, you realize something surprising. He wasn't obsessed with winning battles. He was obsessed with not fighting them. He didn't care about glory or showing off military strength. He cared about one thing: cost. See, Sun Tzu lived in a world where kingdoms were literally bankrupting themselves through endless wars, and he became the first person to say out loud what nobody wanted to hear. The biggest threat to your country isn't the enemy army marching toward you, it's the bill you get when the fighting stops. People think The Art of War is a book about combat. It's actually a book about money. Welcome to The Financial Historian, where we dig into the stories behind money and power, and nothing is ever quite what it seems. To really understand why Sun Tzu was a financial genius, you need to understand the world he lived in. Because his ideas didn't just pop up out of nowhere, they came from watching his world tear itself apart. This was ancient China during what historians call the Spring and Autumn period, around the 6th to 5th centuries BCE. Picture this: the land was divided into dozens of kingdoms, each one convinced it could conquer everyone else and rule everything, and they were all bleeding themselves dry trying to do it. War was everywhere. Kingdoms made alliances one month and stabbed each other in the back the next. Armies kept getting bigger and bigger, evolving from small groups of nobles riding chariots to massive infantry forces that needed mountains of food, weapons, supply routes, and taxes to keep moving. Every time a king sent out an army, he was basically taking out a massive loan against his kingdom's future. And way too often, that loan destroyed them. Here's what most people don't get about ancient warfare: it wasn't romantic or heroic, it was a logistics nightmare. The second an army started marching, the money clock started ticking. You needed wagons, grain, horses, craftsmen to fix armor, blacksmiths to make weapons, cooks to feed everyone, and people to carry all of it. And every single one of those people needed to be paid or fed. A campaign that lasted a few months could bankrupt a small kingdom. One that lasted a year could collapse a big one. But because every kingdom was terrified of being conquered, they kept fighting anyway. It was an arms race that was draining the entire region, and nobody could figure out how to stop it. This is the mess Sun Tzu walked into. He wasn't some philosopher sitting on a mountain thinking deep thoughts. He was a strategist staring at a massive problem. Kingdoms were fighting so much they were destroying themselves. In the West, people love to quote him like he's some ancient self-help guru, but really, he was more like a financial risk manager. He looked at the numbers, the costs, the timelines, the supply chains, realized the way everyone was fighting wars was completely unsustainable. You could win every battle and still lose everything if your treasury collapsed. And most rulers never understood this. They thought the enemy's army was their biggest problem. Sun Tzu knew their own spending was. That's why the most important sentence in The Art of War comes right at the beginning, before he talks about tricks or tactics or anything else. He writes, "War is of vital importance to the state. Not glorious, not honorable, vital meaning dangerous, disruptive, and capable of destroying the very thing it's supposed to protect." The rest of the book is basically Sun Tzu explaining how to keep war contained, controlled, and as cheap as possible. And when you read it that way, you realize what he's really obsessed with: keeping costs down. Even his most famous quotes turn out to be about money when you look closer. When he says the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting, that's not some mystical wisdom, that's just smart economics. It's the ancient version of getting what you want without burning through your cash. When he warns that no nation has ever benefited from prolonged warfare, he's stating a simple financial fact: the longer a war drags on, the more it destroys your ability to function as a country. And when he pushes commanders to be fast, efficient, gather intelligence, and use psychological pressure, it's because all those things are cheaper than armies. Sun Tzu wasn't trying to help you win battles. He was trying to stop you from going bankrupt while trying to win battles. To really appreciate how radical this thinking was, you need to know what Chinese warfare looked like before him. For centuries, aristocratic warriors fought ritualized battles where honor mattered more than actually winning, and nobody really thought about the economic cost. But as populations exploded and technology changed, war scaled up into something completely different. States started creating standardized money, reforming tax systems, and building massive bureaucracies just to keep their armies supplied. War became a national project and a financial death trap. Sun Tzu saw that the old way of thinking was going to kill everyone. War couldn't be treated like some noble sport anymore. It had become a budget crisis that required cold, hard analysis. This is what makes Sun Tzu so unique in history. While most military thinkers celebrated combat and conquest, he treated war like a spreadsheet. He calculated supply chains, resource depletion, and opportunity cost centuries before those concepts even had names. He had zero patience for generals who chased glory at the expense of stability, because he understood something that modern leaders still forget. Every decision on the battlefield is ultimately a decision about whether your country stays financially solvent. And if you get it wrong, you don't just lose soldiers, you lose everything. When you actually read The Art of War with this economic perspective, the whole book transforms. It stops sounding like ancient philosophy and starts sounding like a financial audit. Sun Tzu opens by listing 5 fundamental factors that determine the outcome of war, and underneath the fancy language, they're basically cost variables. The moral law, heaven, earth, the commander, method, and discipline. These aren't mystical categories. They're resource management questions. He's asking, what does this war actually require? How stable is your government? How resilient are your people? How efficiently can you move? How disciplined is your administration? He's doing a risk assessment long before anyone invented the term. And from page 1, he makes it clear, if you can't calculate costs, you have no business planning strategy. That's why so much of the book focuses on logistics instead of heroic battle tactics. Sun Tzu devotes entire sections to the economics of feeding an army, and it's brutally practical. He writes things like, when your army is 20 miles from home, you lose the price of 100 measures of grain. His point is simple. Distance costs money. And the farther you go, the more it multiplies. He explains that transporting supplies drains the treasury faster than paying troops, that keeping an army in the field destroys your agricultural workforce back home, and that wasteful commanders bankrupt nations while winning meaningless fights. For a military manual, it's weirdly uninterested in actual combat and obsessively interested in what combat costs. He tells rulers to steal resources from the enemy, whenever possible, not as a sneaky tactic, but as a financial necessity. He scolds leaders who drag out campaigns, not because they're bad strategists, but because they're financially reckless. Sun Tzu understood something modern governments often forget. Logistics don't just support strategy, logistics are strategy. His approach to intelligence reveals the same financial thinking. Today, when governments debate spy budgets or intelligence funding, they talk about security and ethics. Sun Tzu talked about cost efficiency. A single spy, he explains, can stop an entire army from marching in the wrong direction. One intercepted message can save a nation millions. He writes that what enables the wise sovereign and the good general to strike and conquer and achieve things beyond the reach of ordinary men is foreknowledge, not bravery or military strength. Foreknowledge is just the ancient word for having good information. Sun Tzu saw intelligence not as a nice bonus in warfare, but as the cheapest and most effective weapon you could possibly have. He was the first strategist to understand that wasting information is the same as wasting money. Even his obsession with speed is fundamentally about economics. Speed is the essence of war, he writes. And most people think he means you should attack aggressively. But what Sun Tzu really means is, speed saves money. When he tells commanders to move swiftly where the enemy doesn't expect you, he's describing a financial trick using timing and surprise to avoid the massive costs of head-on conflict. Every day, an army spends marching, waiting, and eating burns through resources. Winning slowly is expensive. Winning through clever maneuvering preserves your wealth. Sun Tzu's famous love of flexibility, adaptability, and psychological warfare isn't poetic philosophy, it's fiscal discipline. But his deepest financial insight runs through the entire book. Every decision involves trade-offs. Every choice a ruler makes closes the door to a cheaper option. Sun Tzu doesn't hate war, he hates waste. And the ultimate waste, in his view, is fighting battles you didn't need to fight. That's why he praises generals who break enemy resistance without bloodshed, who win through diplomacy, intimidation, deception, or alliances. To Sun Tzu, these aren't backup plans, they're the main strategy, because they preserve your resources. In one of his most revealing passages, he warns that rulers who love warfare for its own sake will destroy their own kingdoms. Behind the elegant language is a harsh accounting truth. If you treat war like entertainment instead of a liability, you will eventually go bankrupt. What makes Sun Tzu's financial genius even clearer is what happened to the kingdoms around him. Some poured all their wealth into endless sieges that drained their treasuries and sparked internal rebellions. Others followed Sun Tzu's logic, using intelligence, alliances, and quick strikes to avoid the death spiral of prolonged conflict. The kingdoms that understood war as a financial tool, something to use carefully and strategically, survived. The ones that treated war as a test of strength or honor burned themselves out. Sun Tzu wasn't just right in theory, history proved him right in practice. And here's where this ancient story becomes uncomfortably modern, because Sun Tzu's warnings have echoed through every major conflict of the last 200 years. Modern governments still make the exact same mistake he tried to prevent. They rush into wars without calculating the long-term economic damage, then watch their economies crack under the strain. The Soviet Union in Afghanistan, the United States in Vietnam, the European powers in World War I. These conflicts weren't lost because the armies were weak, they were lost because the economic foundation collapsed. Sun Tzu would have seen it coming immediately. Prolonged warfare destroys your own country faster than the enemy ever could. Meanwhile, the tools Sun Tzu champion, intelligence, deception, targeted operations, rapid strikes, have become the backbone of modern strategy precisely because they're cheaper. Cyber warfare is Sun Tzu. Economic sanctions are Sun Tzu. Proxy wars, covert operations, strategic deterrence, all of them aim for maximum impact with minimum financial exposure. The world's most powerful nations are still operating inside Sun Tzu's framework, whether they realize it or not. But the clearest example of his influence is in how countries think about national power today. Sun Tzu believed real strength came not just from military might, but from economic resilience, your ability to take hits, recover, and keep functioning. He wrote during a time when kingdoms crumbled because they overspent on wars they couldn't afford. We live in a world where superpowers face the same challenge, in different forms: military budgets, national debt, resource dependencies, supply chain vulnerabilities, and the long-term costs of projecting force globally. Sun Tzu might not recognize the technology, but he'd recognize the math instantly. The deeper lesson, the one most people completely miss, is that Sun Tzu wasn't teaching rulers how to win wars. He was teaching them how to avoid destroying their own economies. His real genius was understanding that the cost of conflict outlives the conflict itself. Countries don't fail because they lose battles. Countries fail because they drain the resources that keep them stable, confident, and functional. Victory means nothing if your treasury is empty when it's over. The best war is the one that doesn't leave you financially crippled when it ends. And that's the lens that transforms the art of war into something completely different. It's not a book about being bold or aggressive. It's a book about restraint. It's not about overpowering your opponents. It's about outlasting them. Sun Tzu doesn't celebrate conquest. He celebrates stability. To him, the ruler who preserves resources is wiser than the ruler who captures cities. The general who wins without fighting is smarter than the general who destroys armies, and the nation that knows when not to act is stronger than the one that acts out of pride. Sun Tzu's philosophy isn't the philosophy of a warrior. It's the philosophy of a caretaker, someone responsible for keeping the nation financially healthy over the long term. In the end, Sun Tzu's financial genius comes down to this. He refused to separate economics from power. He understood they're inseparable, that war is simply the most expensive decision a government can make, and that the ruler who miscalculates its cost signs his own death warrant. His message is simple, uncomfortable, and eternally relevant. Strength isn't measured by how hard you can hit, it's measured by how much you can afford to hit. And history shows that when economic systems collide, it's not the bravest nation that survives, it's the most financially disciplined one. History doesn't repeat itself, but if you don't understand it, you'll pay the price anyway. If this gave you a fresh way of looking at things, hit that subscribe button. History holds the answers, and I'll show you exactly where to find them.